Hey, it's Jackie here from the Early Years Learning Hub. And before we get started, I wanted to let you know about our subscription option. If you're a fan of our podcasts and would like to see us continue to bring you interesting speakers on all of the topics you didn't even know you needed to hear about, as well as accessing some really great resources to help you put some of the ideas from the podcast into practice, then why not subscribe? It is great value at just $2.99 plus GST per month and is automatically debited from your bank account. Simply go to our website, Early Years Learning Hub, and click on the subscribe button. Welcome to another Early Years Learning Hub podcast. My name is Jackie Ward and I'm the founder and managing director of the Early Years Learning Hub. This episode is one of our practice sharing series where I invite teachers, educators and leaders to share their practice and tell us some of the things that work for them. Today I'm joined by Ebony Birch-Hanger, Neuro-Sensory Education Specialist, and we'll be discussing how understanding neurosensory support teachers and educators to better support children to self-regulate. And we've been talking with Ebony across a series, and this is the third in our series, and we are focused in today on unpacking the role of the environment in either supporting regulation or contributing to dysregulation. So, Ebony, would you like to tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and your professional journey?
Sure. Thanks for having me back, Jackie. Great to be here. And I originally trained as an early childhood and primary teacher, but since my early childhood years, I found I was able to very easily relate to and guide individuals who didn't quite fit the mould, so those who interacted with the world differently from the majority. And so when I was working in childcare and school settings, I very quickly realised I wasn't able to support the children I wanted to in the way that I wanted to, within the systems and resources that were available in those settings. So I opened my own early childhood and own education and therapy centre. I worked with individuals from 2 right through to senior years, running individual and group programs, and worked with a lot of individuals who would be considered to have quite complex behavioural profiles, sensory profiles and communication needs. Over the years, I completed additional study in special education, deaf education and neurodevelopmental therapy. And I worked as a consultant in educational settings. It was really through offering my own music and movement programs, speech and language, social and emotional, and full educational programs at my centre that I really refined my beliefs and values and the processes which form the basis of the approach that I use today.
Well, that sounds like an interesting journey and lots of research and study, and I love to hear everyone's story. I hope it motivates other people to, if they've got an interest, to follow it or a passion. Now, I know we talked about in the first episode, we kind of talked as an overview of, the 3 pillars of behaviour. So I would really love it if you could just give us a little very quick recap before we sort of dive into the environment as being a significant factor. So can you refresh everyone's memory on that?
Yeah, so there's essentially 3 pillars to my work out why approach that I use when working to support children displaying behaviours, and the first being the nervous system. The second one is the environment, so things, people, routines and expectations. And then the third is the neurosensory systems, so including the sensory systems of the body and the processing systems of the brain. So they're the 3 main aspects I look at and evaluate and use the information I gain from nervous system, environment and sensory systems to work out how to best support the child in front of me.
I love that, looking at the things from multiple perspectives. And if anyone's interested, episode 2, we focused in on the nervous system and chatted to Ebony about unpacking that one. So this one, we're going to look at the importance of the environment. So let's start with the why the environment is so important, Ebony.
Yeah, so it has a direct influence on the nervous system. I did briefly mention that last time. So the nervous system gains cues of safety or threat from the environment. It's the senses and the sensory systems that are constantly receiving information from the environment the child is in. And so the environment is therefore directly impacting and influencing the internal state of children. That determines whether they're actually able to remain regulated or whether they become dysregulated depending on the information their body is receiving from the environment that they are in.
I think it's often a really under acknowledged important factor when when someone comes to, a conversation about, oh, I've got this child with really challenging behaviours. The very first thing I think of, and I can notice it as soon as I walk into is the environment. This environment is overstimulating or not stimulating enough, or there's so many children in the one spot. There's so many things that I think. And the good thing about this and chatting about this one is I feel like they're probably the easiest of fixes to do, because if you did some of the thinking after we chat in this podcast, there's some of the things that you can very quickly change in your environment. So I feel like this is a great easy win for people. I'm not saying that deeper reflection wouldn't be necessary, but I feel like it's a really good thing for people to learn. Looking at the environment with a critical lens. So as I said, I've done some work when we were chatting before. I've talked about some work that I've done with the universal design teams about, the idea that if you make an environment inclusive for some children with additional needs, it's sort of better for everyone, basically. So could you share with some ideas about how environments can be overwhelming or too stimulating, and how they can be contributing to that sort of regulation or dysregulation?
Yeah, sure. So if we're thinking about early childhood specifically, the design of early childhood environments can lend themselves quite easily to overstimulation. Early childhood educators are great at making sure there are lots of different sections available, lots of different materials available for children, covering a different range of different topic areas, and we have different textures and different smells and different sights and colours, and lots of opportunities for children to gain a lot of really important sensory input from the environment, but that can also be very overstimulating for not just children who may have a diagnosis, but for any child that is in that setting. The advantage, though, that I believe early childhood educators have is that there's the ability to adapt the environments and to really design spaces. There's not that same flexibility in primary school settings or particularly secondary school settings. So in the early childhood, we do have that flexibility to be able to adapt an environment. So what I encourage educators to think about is not just the aesthetics. Of course, if we have a space that looks beautiful and that is really calming and grounding, that can certainly contribute to regulation. But we want to go a step further. So look beyond the aesthetics as well, to think about what is actually in this environment and what is contributing to the children's system. So what information are they actually receiving? And the first place to start is looking at, is this environment predictable? So is it predictable? Is it familiar? Is it supportive? So are there a variety of resources available that could support regulation? Is it adaptable? Can we make changes to this environment fairly quickly if we need to? And is there a balance of input? So do we have a variety of input that will support all of the senses without overwhelming them? So one of the things in early childhood is that I know I used to do as an early childhood educator, and I've seen lots of early childhood educators do, is changing the environment and introducing new activities. So this may be done on a weekly basis, it may be done on a fortnightly basis, where you sort of go, okay, we're going to have these activities out for the next fortnight, and then we're going to change everything. We're going to change the room around. We're going to change the orientation. We're going to get rid of all of these activities and we're going to put a whole bunch of new ones in. And so that's when we need to think about, how are we preparing children for that change? Giving them warning that the next time they come into the centre, it's going to look different. That's not going to be over there. We're not going to have the block corner over here anymore. There's not going to be dress-ups over there. The Play-Doh's not going to be out next week. And preparing children for what's going to be leaving the environment, what's going to be added into the environment, and what it's going to look like. Giving them as much preparation as we can, which, as I say, you have the flexibility to do as an early childhood educator, which is great.
Yeah, that's a really good tip, Ebony. I hadn't thought about that. The idea of, if we're thinking about really being genuinely child-centred, involving them in, maybe you're still making the program decisions about what's going to change, but involving them in the preparation for change and that things are going to move around. And I think it's always a fine line too, because I think sometimes if the environment is too understimulating, as in hasn't been enough change. Maybe those same toys have been out there for 3 months, that's when children might get a little bit, I don't want to play with that anymore. I've done that sort of thing. So it's, by no means suggesting that end of the spectrum, but just thinking and reflecting, I think critically reflecting on how children are responding to toys and equipment, I think in our space, we've got a shelf that has all these loose parts to it. And you just notice that there's some, like, for example, the cars, we have a basket of cars there. The children really love those. We've got some squares of material. We've got some different things that children will always come back to and use in a variety of different ways. But then you notice there's some things that they've sort of gone off for a while. So those are the bits that we might change. But I love that idea, and I'll definitely be implementing that next term when I'm changing things around, just letting children know that that's happening, and, even giving them a bit of a choice in what they want to keep or what they think they're still engaged with. I love that.
Absolutely. And when you mentioned, having those cars on the shelf in your setting, that's that familiarity that I was talking about, and that predictability, and that is important. So, when we're making changes, maybe we don't change everything. We do keep some things the same so that there's something familiar that the children have already been using, that while they're taking the time to process the changes in the environment and to process the new activities that are there, they can go back to what is familiar and what is predictable and what they already know, while their system is adjusting to what has changed.
Yeah, love that. Love that. Another thing that I'm super passionate about, and I would say that we have changed our routine so many times in the last couple of years, because I'm always tweaking it, thinking, and the updates to the early years learning framework have included in the references in the learning environments advice, stuff about temporal use of time. And I think about that a lot because it's such an important one to allow children large blocks of time. So what are your thoughts on, like routines, and in particular, I think minimizing transitions and allowing for long uninterrupted periods of time? Because I feel like, all education settings, there's lots of changes all the time, but in early childhood, I think, because we've got to add in the million times that children eat and all the other things, it feels like you never really get any chance to do anything. So what are your thoughts on routines?
Yeah, so look, there's a lot of really important points when I think about routines. And so as I mentioned before, when I'm considering the environment, I am considering routines within that. I'm not just looking at objects or things in the space. And routines are really important to consider because they also can send cues of safety or threat to the nervous system. So when I'm thinking about time, I think about two aspects: time within the routines and then time between routines. And so if we look at the time within a routine, we want to look at minimizing the waiting time. So minimizing if it's a food the children are eating, you mentioned that one. So within that routine, there might be, hand washing first, and then there might be, finding a space to eat, and then there might be waiting for food to be served if it's served to them, or, getting food from their own lunchbox. I know different settings work differently, but there are still lots of steps and elements within that routine. And then, when one child's finished eating, what are they doing while the other children are still eating? So the first important part is to think about how do we minimize the waiting time during that routine, and how many steps are there? So I just mentioned a few elements there. We've got the hand washing, we've got the waiting for the food, we've got the eating, we've got the then waiting after children have finished. How many steps are involved in the one routine, and how much time is spent on each step? So you might have a routine that goes for 15 minutes, and there may be 5 steps within that routine, but one of the steps is taking 8 minutes out of the 15. And you think, is that too long a time to be spent on that particular part of that routine? How could we shorten that, or how can we change the steps around or support the children through the steps? So that's the first aspect, thinking about the time within a routine and how many steps are involved. Then if I think about between routines, you mentioned the uninterrupted play. And so I would be looking at how many structured routines do we have in place in our day? And are they all needed? Do we need all of the structured routines that we have? could we combine some of the routines together? And when we do that, we would be minimizing the number of transitions that we had. Because essentially every time you have a routine, you could look at it two ways. You could say we've got 2 transitions in and out of the routine, or we could actually say there's 4. So we're transitioning out of play, there's 1, into the routine, that's 2. Then we're transitioning out of the routine, that's 3, and back into play. So within one routine, the children have 4 different transitions, which is a lot. And that's a lot of time where there's possibility for dysregulation within those times. So we've looked at time within the routines, time between the routines, and then how long is between the routines. So you mentioned that uninterrupted play. Are we leaving enough space between our structured routines to give children that time to have uninterrupted play? Or do we have a structured routine in place every 10 to 15 minutes, which is actually causing a lot of disruption and a lot of transitions? So it might be the case of moving one of your routines 5 minutes later or 5 minutes earlier. And that 5-minute shift can make a big difference to how long children are getting in that uninterrupted playtime. And then I guess the other really important element is how are we actually supporting children within the routines? So how are we interacting with them? How are we making sure the routines feel predictable and to feel familiar? What supports are in place within each routine? And as I say, that interaction is really important. That's really key. How are we actually interacting with the children during the routine? And are our interactions supporting regulation or contributing to dysregulation?
Yeah, I'm thinking away while you're saying all of this, Ebony, and definitely reflecting on some of the things those are definitely some of the things that we critically reflected on and where we could do, like we try and have a very long uninterrupted period of time in the morning, but that's meant traditionally I would have done like a group experience in the morning, but I've moved it to kind of the afternoon. And the same thing, being really purposeful, not to have children coming to the mat and doing something else, coming here and doing something else, like trying to think about where will the children be and could we do the things that might all be together, but varied enough to be inclusive of everyone who's, attention spans and all that kind of stuff. And also I like that idea too, because we've got a little boy at the moment in one of our groups that has a lot of difficulties. He's got autism, so he's got a diagnosis, and he's not, he's not causing any trouble. He's not overt about the fact that but he just sort of hangs back. He doesn't like the noise of the hand dryer, so he doesn't like to go into the bathroom when everybody else is in there, he finds those things quite hard, but he could be easily missed in the busyness of everyone else doing those sorts of things. So I think even that idea of stepping back and noticing how different children are responding to transitions and what seems to be some common behaviours or traits that you hadn't noticed before. So yeah, awesome. Thank you. Good reflections for my practice. Next thing we're talking about is interactions. So such an important one, particularly because I think it's so closely related, to the adults in the space giving children the attention and safety that they need. Because I think sometimes as busy teachers and educators, we can be busy doing the things, whatever the things are, cleaning up, tidying up, packing away, setting up, whatever, that we don't always give children, that time to feel the safety. And that can almost always leads to more issues and challenges. So if you spend that time, it's so important. So can you tell us a bit more about this important aspect of environments?
Yeah, so if you remember from episode 2, for those who have listened and those who haven't, if you go back and have a listen to that, I spoke about the fact that when the nervous system is receiving cues of safety or threat, not only are they coming from the physical environment, but they are also coming from in between. And that's in between the children and the adults or other children in the room that they are interacting with. So that key element of relationships is either going to support regulation in the nervous system or result in dysregulation. So there's a few different aspects we can think about. First thing, and probably it's something that a lot of people don't actually think about, but it's where I always started, is me. Like, what's on my person? So, for example, this top that I'm wearing today, I would never wear a top like this when I was working with children. Didn't matter what environment I was in. I had a whole wardrobe of plain tops. Plain old, no patterns, no florals, no bright colours, no, just plain. Because a lot of the individuals that I were working with would result in dysregulation if they had patterns or bright colours or things that were very, bold. in their visual field. So I was just always aware that I didn't wear anything like this when I was working with children. Scents, so I wouldn't ever wear perfume. I was mindful of the, the conditioners and shampoos and things that I used in my hair. And jewelry, if you've got, necklace on or bracelet, that can reflect against the light. So, and that can cause, again, overstimulation in the visual system. So that's a good place to start, is thinking about what's on your person, because when you're interacting with a child, particularly early childhood spaces, we're generally in fairly close proximity to children. And so anything that is on us is therefore in their space. So what's on your person first? And then proximity that I just mentioned is the second aspect to think about. Sometimes, as I say, I notice in early childhood environments, it's the natural thing to get close to children because they're small. We want to show that we're caring, and we want to show that we're there to support them, and we get down to their level, which is really important. But are we too close? Are there some children who need more space during our interactions? Thinking about things like tone of voice. Sometimes it can be very easy to, particularly if we're in a rush and we're thinking, oh gosh, and I wanted to do this, and it took so long to get all the children inside, and now we're a bit behind, and we're going to serve morning tea late, and then that's going to put it. And we get into this state and we start talking a bit like I'm talking now, and our tone of voice changes, and we've got a kind of harsh, sharp tone of voice, and it's rushing, and what's the result of that going to be on the children in the space? So thinking about our tone of voice and the pace that we're speaking about, sometimes we just need to slow ourselves down and take a breath and think about, when we're interacting, what's input are we giving to the children's systems, basically? And is the input that we are giving them going to be contributing to regulation or dysregulation? And if we have a child in front of us who is displaying certain behaviours, whether it be louder, bigger, more explosive behaviours, or whether it be those quiet, withdrawn, inward shutdown behaviours, we're going to scan the environment and look at what's around, and then we're going to think about us as well. And what are we doing, and how could we adjust what we're doing and how we're interacting in that particular moment?
Yeah, and I'm often reminded about too that sort of base notion of, that's referenced in Circle of Security, being that secure base of attachment as well. So, sometimes, as you said, there'll be children that need some space, but if you're available and you're sitting and you're open to children coming to you when they need it, I think that's a really important one as well, isn't it? Awesome. So many great tips here. Well, I think we're finishing up on one more, expectations. And this is a really, really important one, because I often think about this. Like there's these expectations. For example, I often see, in babies and toddlers' rooms, just educators trying to do a whole group experience with 15 toddlers or babies who are tired and hungry, and, someone's rounding them up and bringing them back. And I'm like, this feels like torture to me, not a learning experience. So I think expectations is a really appropriate one as to, what are we expecting children to do, and are they on track, So can you share a little thoughts on that one?
Yeah, and look, I've just really got one thought on expectation. It's a really simple one. Thinking about, and I think you mentioned at some point, certain children on certain days. So we're sending cues of safety, and therefore our expectations of children are either going to send those cues of safety or those cues of threat. And what a child is able to do in each moment is going to change not only from week to week, from day to day, but from hour to hour, or even minute to minute. So we just need to think about, for this particular child, in this particular moment, what is a reasonable expectation for them? Something that they were able to do yesterday, they may not be able to do today. Something that they found easy last week, they may find difficult today. So this child in this moment right now, is this a reasonable expectation? And if it's not, if we can see that it's contributing to dysregulation, then we just adjust.
Yeah. And I think that's a really important, critical reflection discussion to have as a team. If you have got a child who has additional needs or is exhibiting some challenging behaviours, everyone needs to be on the same page about that, because I can imagine that would be really contributing to dysregulation if everyone's got different expectations of that child at different times, and it's unclear as to what's expected of them. So that's a really good one. So I guess we'll wrap up now, just to say, you have given some good examples, but sharing some targeted approaches so our listeners have got some walk away tomorrow with some strategies they could use.
Yeah, so just as a recap, the environment is just one pillar that we're looking at when we're faced with behaviours that indicate dysregulation. And we always want to look for the why. Why is this child behaving this way? And the environment can be one reason. So I actually have an evaluation, environmental evaluation steps PDF. It's just a free PDF that your listeners can access. And I take them through this process, which I will just briefly go through now so they can start implementing it tomorrow after they've listened. So when I'm evaluating the environment, I'm looking for things and objects, people, routines, and expectations. So those elements that we spoke about today. And I want to look at what is there too much of? That's the first thing. Second thing is what is there too little of? So not enough. And the third is what is already present here in the environment that we may need to adjust. So for the aspects that there are too much of, our action step is going to be to remove what we can, right? So if there is too much visual clutter in this space, we're going to remove some of it. If there are too many children in this space, we're going to remove some children from this area. If there's things that are too little, we want to add. So our action step is to add. So we're looking at the environment and we're thinking there's too little soft, calm spaces in this environment. There's not enough calm, soft spaces. So we're going to add an area over here where we have some cushions, maybe some books, some soft teddies, some plushies, maybe some draping curtains, etc. So if there's too little of something, we want to add it. And then for those aspects where there's not the right type of input, our action step is to adjust. So I might look around and think, okay, well, there's lots of toys here in this space, but maybe we don't have the right type of toy for this group of children on this particular day. So we'll just adjust what we've got available. So remove, add, or adjust based on what we've evaluated in the environment. And as I say, I've got a sheet listeners can access where I actually give lots of examples of the stimuli for them to look at to help them become a really keen observer of the environment.
That's amazing. I'll make sure we put the link to that in the show notes. That's awesome. So I guess that brings us to the end of this episode. So thank you for joining us, Ebony. It's been really great. I'm sure our listeners are getting lots out of this whole series, but particularly this one. And we'll see you again for episode 4 of the Neuro-Sensory series.
Great. Thanks very much, Jackie.
So you've been listening to another episode of the Early Years Learning Hub podcast. And I'll also put in some links in the show notes to some of our courses that you might find helpful, supporting children with additional needs, supporting children's behaviour, and helping children to self-regulate. Thanks again.